Welcome to English with Mr. Harding, and welcome back to those of you who've been with us before. I hope you're finding this content helpful and useful and enjoyable as well. And if you are finding it helpful and useful, can I please ask you just to like, to subscribe, to share. That's a great way of you being able to actually share this useful and helpful content with other people in your world, and it just helps them as well so that they can get this content into their inbox as well. Well, we are in the middle of a series which I'm calling I'd Like to Get Better At. And in this series, what we're doing is we're unpacking concepts that you've probably come across in English in your lessons, and we're trying to look at them in a little bit of detail to try and really understand the thinking behind that concept so that you can gain confidence in it and you can apply it in your English, and whether you are in year 7, year 8, year 9, year 10, 11, 12, or 13. So wherever you are on that scale. And tonight, in today's session, we'll be exploring the idea of narrators. And during this session, I'd like to answer 2 questions, and here they are. The first question is this one: what different types of narrator are there? And then secondly, why might a writer choose one type of narrator over another? So, narrators. So let's first of all talk about what a narrator is before we even talk about what different types there are. A narrator is the person that the writer chooses to tell the story. I don't know if you've realized this, but every single time a writer actually writes a book, they choose to tell the story from a particular point of view. There is someone who is relating the events and the incidents and the characters to us, and that is the narrator. Now, the important thing to understand in English is the narrator and the writer are not necessarily the same thing. The writer may choose the narrator as a mouthpiece or as a person who in some way represents their point of view. Sometimes writers will actually choose narrators that don't represent their point of view, that don't represent what they believe. And there will be reasons why they choose that. So that's who the narrator is. The narrator is the person that the writer has chosen to tell their story. So that's what the narrator is. Let's look at the first of our 2 main questions that we're investigating in today's session. Question number 1, what different types of narrator are there? Now, there are lots of different types of narrator, but in today's session, I want to deal with the 4 main types of narrator. And I have with me a number of some really favorite books of mine that I want to use. So I've got The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time. I can definitely recommend that. And this is one of my all-time favorites of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, American writer, but an amazing, amazing story. And then this one, Soul Eater by Michelle Pavers. So we're going to be looking at those and using those as examples to explore what the different types of narrator are and to maybe unpack why a writer may choose that particular type of narrator. So let's deal with the first type of narrator right now. The first type of narrator is first-person narration. Now, first-person narration is where the writer has chosen to tell the story from the point of view of a particular character, and that the word you're looking for here and the letter is I. In first-person narration, it's told from the point of view of the person or the character that the writer has created. Now, to help you understand narration, there's a really, really helpful metaphor. So I want you to imagine that when a writer comes to write a story, imagine it much like a camera. Now, when we're talking about first-person narration, what then happens is that the writer is choosing to tell the story from the point of view of the camera. It's if we're inside the camera itself and we can see everything that that character sees. So it's almost like we're inside of their head, looking behind the lens of their eye, and we see every single thing that they do. And that's what we find in this particular book, the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. Now, I want to read to you just the first part of the chapter so you can get an idea. And then we're going to unpack this secondary question that I asked: why might a writer choose one type of narrator over another? So, it's the first chapter, and interestingly enough, it says 2. It was 7 minutes after midnight. The dog was lying on the grass in the middle of the lawn in front of Mrs. Shear's house. Its eyes were closed. It looked as if it was running on its side, the way dogs run when they think that they are chasing a cat in a dream. But the dog was not running or asleep. The dog was dead. There was a garden fork sticking out of the dog. The points of the fork must have gone all the way through the dog and into the ground because the fork had not fallen over. I decided that the dog was probably killed with the fork because I could not see any other wounds in the dog. And I do not think you would stick a garden fork into a dog after it had died for some other reason, like cancer, for example, or a road accident. But I could not be certain about this. I went through Mrs. Shear's gate, closing it behind me. I walked onto her lawn and knelt beside the dog. I put my hand on the muzzle of the dog. It was still warm. The dog was called Wellington. It belonged to Mrs. Shear's, who was our friend. She lived on the opposite side of the road, 2 houses to the left. Wellington was a poodle. Not one of the small poodles that have hairstyles, but a big poodle. It had curly black fur, but when you got close, you could see that the skin underneath the fur was very pale yellow, like chicken. I stroked Wellington and wondered who had killed him and why. And that's the end of the first chapter of this novel. Now, as you can see here, this is a first-person narration. We could hear about 6 or 7 lines in, you heard I. It says, for example, we read, as we look at this first-person narration, I decided the dog was probably killed, but I could not be certain about this. I went through Mrs. Shear's gate, closing it behind me. Now, you may not have read this book, but this book is actually written by a 15-year-old called Christopher. So obviously that is the narrator the writer has chosen. The writer is not a 15-year-old boy called Christopher, but the person telling the story is. And if you were listening very carefully to that first chapter, you'll have noticed a few odd things. You'll notice the almost detailed and mechanical way in which the narrator tells what's happened to Wellington. Interestingly enough, there's no emotional reaction. Christopher doesn't, for example, scream or cry out. He just notes the different details that he sees about the killed dog. Notice, for example, how he focuses on the details about the fork being inside of the dog. And rather than being freaked out by the fact that the dog is dead, he's trying to work out who had killed the dog and why. So this brings us on to this question of why do we think the writer in this particular case chose first-person narration? Why choose a 15-year-old boy called Christopher? Well, the reason for this is because the writer had chosen quite an unusual character to tell the story. In this case, it's not just the fact that Christopher is 15 that is odd here, because he's obviously younger than the writer. The odd thing is the way in which Christopher sees the world. And as you begin to read the story more and more, you realize that Christopher really struggles with emotions. Actually, the writer has chosen to write this story from the point of view of a 15-year-old autistic boy. Now, if you don't know a lot about autism, and many people who've read this book didn't before they read it, why the writer has chosen this particular point of view is he's trying to help the reader understand what the world might look like to someone who is 15 years old and autistic, and all of the difficulties that they face in the world. It's a really great way of actually helping the reader to understand more about the world from a unique point of view. Now, we've looked at first-person narration, and I do really encourage you, if you have not read this book, read it. It is interesting, it is intriguing, it will give you a unique insight into what autism is like, but it's also at times just laugh out loud funny. Now, I want to look at the second of these 4 different types of narrator. And the second particular one that I want to look at is third person limited narrative perspective. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? So what does it mean? Well, what it means is, and to use this illustration that I've been using before, if first person is we're inside of the camera and we're seeing everything that the camera lens sees. Imagine you're on a film set. Here's what third person limited narrative perspective is. It's like we're on the shoulder of the camera. So if the camera is my shoulders, instead of being inside of my head and I'm just seeing everything that character is seeing, it's slightly different. I'm slightly more removed, but I'm still mainly seeing what that character sees. And this particular book, Soul Eater, is a great example of that. And I'll just read the first couple of paragraphs of this. If you've not read this before, it's part of a series called The Chronicles of Ancient Darkness. And in this particular book, this is the third of a number of the books, and there's been 2 other books before it called Wolf Brother and Spirit Walker. And it deals with a main character called Torak. But rather than Torak telling the story himself, there is a narrator who is telling the story for us. But the narrator limits what they tell us to what Torak can see and what Torak can think. And you'll hear that as I read this. Torak didn't want it to be an omen. He didn't want it to be anything more than an owl feather lying in the snow, so he ignored it. That was his first mistake. Quietly, he went back to the tracks they'd been following since dawn. They looked fresh. He slipped off his mitten and felt them. No ice in the bottom. Yes, fresh. Turning to Wren, further uphill, he slapped his sleeve and raised his forefinger, then pointed down in the beech wood. 1 reindeer, heading south. Wren gave a nod, whipped an arrow from her quiver, and knocked it into her bow. Like Torak, she was hard to see in a pale reindeer hide parka and leggings, with wood ash smeared on her face to mask her scent. Like him, she was hungry, having eaten nothing since a slip of dried boar meat for day meal. Unlike him, she hadn't seen the owl feather. So that's third person limited narrative perspective. Now, as you can see here, this is still telling the story from Torak's point of view. But whereas in first person narration, you get to deeply see every single thing that the character or the narrator who is telling the story is thinking and feeling, here the writer has the opportunity to give us Torak's feelings and thoughts, and focus is very much on them, but it also then allows the writer to maybe fill in some of the blanks about what the other characters are thinking and feeling as well. Because one of the things about first person narration, and one of its limits, is that the writer, when they come to write in first person, they have to limit themselves, because they can only limit themselves to the kinds of things that that particular character would think, would feel. And in many ways, that can be a great way to tell a story, because as they're telling the story and all the different events that are taking place, you have an intimate sense of exactly how that particular narrator is thinking and feeling at any time. However, when it comes to first person narration, one of the things that you need to consider and bear in mind is that because that first person narrator only sees things through their own filtered perspective, they may not necessarily see things correctly. So they may make assumptions about other characters and other people that actually later on in the story they learn are untrue. The distance that you get with third person narration means that the writer can, if he wishes to or she wishes to, actually share that with the reader at the time they want to. So that's third person limited narrative perspective. Now, the next perspective I want to talk to you about is something called third-person omniscient narrator. Now, once again, as soon as you hear that, you're probably thinking, what does that mean? Well, it's to do with this word omniscient, and it comes from two Latin words, omni meaning all, and then scient, which means seeing. So translated, it literally means all-seeing narrator. Now, to use this metaphor that I've been using of a camera, if first-person narration is we're inside of the camera, if third-person limited narrative perspective is we're almost on the shoulder of the camera, then third-person omniscient narration is you're actually above the camera, many, many miles away. And the great thing about this is that it allows the narrator to go and tell whichever story they want to. They're not limited to just focusing on one character. Because remember, one of the limits of, say, something like third-person narration is that the writer can only tell you the story of the places that that particular character goes. They can't tell you something that that character didn't see. They can't tell you something about an event that happened that that character wasn't present at. This is why sometimes in first-person narration or third-person limited narrative perspective, writers have sometimes used letters. So, for example, the main character might receive a letter from another character telling them about an event that they weren't actually present at. What the writer's been forced to do in this case is the writer's been forced to try and fill you in on an important piece of information that you need to know about, but because that character wasn't actually there for that event, they need to have another character sending a letter to them. Third-person omniscient narration gets away from this because it's all-seeing. It's like a massive camera that looks over the whole dome of this particular character's life or existence. The great thing about that is that the narrator can just drop into whichever particular home, whichever particular moment, whichever particular character they want to fill you in on all the details that are important for the story. So we might have one chapter that focuses on one particular home, on one particular character, and then the narrator moves to another home, another set of characters, taking us almost on this journey where we get to see lots and lots of different characters and lots of different ways in which they may be responding to the events that are taking place. Now, that's a great advantage for a writer. It means you can go anywhere, any place, anytime. The downside is that sometimes with third-person omniscient narrators, because they're kind of removed from the action and they can go anywhere, almost a bit like a godlike character or figure, sometimes it can be more difficult for us as the reader to connect with the particular character because we're thinking, well, who's the character I'm supposed to be tracking here? Who's the character I'm supposed to be interested in? Whereas when it comes to third-person limited narrative perspective, because you're focusing largely on one character, you begin to form a bond with them. And similarly, when it comes to first-person narration, we then also form a bond with them too. So I'm just going to read you the first opening of Mice and Men. And I'm just going to read you about 6 or 7 lines. And you'll notice something here. You'll notice as it's third-person omniscient narration, you'll notice in this particular case, it doesn't even focus actually on characters. To begin with, it uses a technique we call zooming in. In other words, it starts really far out and then zooms into the main action. Here's how it starts. Chapter 1. A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the golden foothills slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gabalan Mountains. But on the valley side, the water is lined with trees, willows fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding, and sycamores with mottled, white, recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. On the sandy bank, under the trees, the leaves lie deep and so crisp that a lizard makes a great skittering if he runs among them. Rabbits come out of the brush to sit on the sand in the evening, and the damp flats are covered with the night tracks of coons, and with the spread pads of dogs from the ranches, and with the split wedge tracks of deer that come to drink in the dark. There is a path through the willows and among the sycamores, a path beaten hard by boys coming down from the ranches to swim in the deep pool, and beaten hard by tramps who come wearily down from the highway in the evening to the jungle up near water. In front of the low horizontal limb of a giant sycamore, there is an ash pile made by many fires. The limb is worn smooth by the men who have sat upon it. And then, after this point, as this goes on, the writer introduces our two main characters. Now you'll notice, as is often quite common with omniscient narrators, they begin by introducing us to the world that they've created. In this particular case, it's a world that people would have known. It's not an artificial world, it's not a made-up world like science fiction. It's a real part of the world, but the story obviously is made up by the writer. In this case, it's 1930s California. And the great thing about third-person narration is that the writer, as he weaves his story, we focus on these two main characters, but we also get the great opportunity to see other characters as well. And we get the great opportunity to see things from their point of view. And the writer's then able to fill us in on some of the thoughts that they have. And remember, that is the great freedom of third-person omniscient narration. Because if you think about it properly, when it comes to yours or my point of view, I only know really what I think and feel. If I'm quite observant, I may have a good idea what you're thinking and feeling, but because I'm not in your head, I don't ever actually truly know unless I ask you. In third-person omniscient narration, what the writer is able to do, he's able to give you the intimate thoughts and feelings and ideas of every single character who is important to the story. And he can give you their inner thoughts, their inner ideas. Because as the narrator, he can, as it were, just drop in on this character, give you their thoughts and feelings, and then move on to another character. And as he drops into those different characters, they will all fill out the jigsaw puzzle and the jigsaw piece of the story that they're writing and developing. So those are the different types of narration. And as I've been explaining with each different type of narration, I hope you're also getting a good idea of why a writer may actually choose to write in a particular style. The fourth and the final type of narrator that I want to deal with right now, and I just want to point you to some examples, is something we call the unreliable narrator. Now, I want to give you a really famous example of an unreliable narrator. I don't have the book in front of me, but I can tell you what it is. It's called The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and it's written by a famous crime writer called Agatha Christie. Now, this book was released in the 1920s, and when it was released, it caused a storm. And let me tell you why. It was written in first person, so nothing unusual there. It was written from the point of view of a doctor. And in the story, the doctor is telling us the story of what happened when a murder was committed. The detective, Hercule Poirot, who is a famous creation of Agatha Christie, is called into the murder scene to try and work out who the murderer is. And all the way through the story, Hercule Poirot and the narrator, the doctor, are working together to try and uncover who is the murderer. And then right at the very end of the story, the final couple of chapters, something amazing is revealed to us. Something shocking and something that we don't expect. At the end of one of the chapters, Hercule Poirot is explaining how he's come to the conclusion of who the murderer is. And the chapter ends with the famous line saying, "I'm speaking of you, Monsieur Doctor." And at this point, suddenly, our eyes are opened and we realize that the narrator of the story is also the murderer. And it's such a brilliant way of telling the story, because the way that Christie sets it up, the way in which the doctor seems to follow Poirot about, it has more of the relationship of Sherlock Holmes and with the doctor being Dr. Watson. In other words, because the doctor is telling us information about the murder and telling us information about the investigation, the reader naturally assumes that we're listening to somebody who is innocent. Whereas in actual fact, as the final couple of chapters reveal, it's been the doctor all along. And that actually the doctor has withheld certain pieces of information at different points. And that we were fooled. But they're not the only person to have done this. Another really great example, and again, I won't spoil it for you because I feel like I've already spoiled The Murder of Roger Ackroyd for you. I encourage you to read this book. It's called The Turbulent Term of Tyke Tyler. It's about 40 years old, so it's a bit dated in terms of the kind of primary school that it represents. But why am I recommending it to you? I'm recommending it to you because there's something interesting about this narrator. They're not an unreliable narrator, but there is an assumption that we make about this narrator that the final chapters reveal, oh, I wasn't expecting that. So I encourage you to read that as well. So those are the 4 different types of narration that you will mostly come across. Let me just recap them. First person narration, so that you're looking for I. The second type is third person narration, but limited narrative perspective. So it's told with he, she, but generally speaking, it will be the thoughts and feelings of one major character that you will see. Third type, third person omniscient narration. This is where there is a narrator somewhere almost in a godlike position who is telling the story of all the different characters in this world that the writer has created. And the final one that we've discussed in today's session is the unreliable narrator, or narrator who something has been assumed about them right from the very beginning that turns out to be untrue. And you can understand why a writer would want to use that type of narrator, because it's interesting, it's exciting, and of course, it's not what we expect. On narrators, just a final thing actually to point out, it's quite common these days for sometimes it used to be that narrators were always the heroes of the story. But one of the things that's happened, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, is that you'll often find writers creating a character we call the antihero. In other words, it's someone telling the story who really we shouldn't be rooting for them. Really, we shouldn't want them to succeed. But actually, because underneath it all, there's something likable about them, or that maybe their cause is just, that actually we find ourselves rooting for them, even though maybe perhaps what they're going to do is very, very wrong. An example of this might be this. Let's say it's first person narration. And maybe the person telling the story is someone who is out to kill someone else. Now, naturally, we'd be like, well, that's absolutely wrong. But maybe as we listen to the narrator, we discover that actually the narrator is not out to kill someone just because they want to kill. They're out to get revenge. And they're out to get revenge because someone maybe hurt or killed their family. And by revealing that over the course of the novel, what we might discover is perhaps we have more sympathy for the narrator than we did at first realize. Thank you so much for joining us once again. And I hope to see you again on English with Mr. Harding. Remember, you can comment, you can like, you can subscribe, and you can share this so that it can be useful and helpful to those in your world too. I'll see you next time.